Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
We've had conversations now over the past couple of months, and today feels like a real turning point in the war between Israel and Hamas. Israel announced that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas and the mastermind behind October 7th, has been killed in Gaza due to an Israeli airstrike on Thursday. What's your reaction?
Well, look, it's obviously good news for the Israelis. This was the man who orchestrated and planned and executed the 10/7 attacks. In other words, this is a man who's got the blood of 1,200 Israelis who were killed on that day, 245 hostages, as well as another 300 or so Israeli soldiers that have been killed on the battlefields of Gaza. So there is, I think, a sense of justice served on the part of Israelis. They're celebrating on the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem tonight. But I think we need to be realistic here about a few things. Number one is, Hamas does look like it is defeated. There's very few of their leaders left that I could even recognize. And I'm someone that has studied Hamas over the course of 25, 30 years. There's only a handful of folks left in that org chart that I would even be able to, pick out of a lineup. And I think that's obviously the good news. Then there's the reality that begins to set in, which is that Israel's fighting a war on 6 other fronts, right? They're still fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're fighting a bunch of different terrorist groups in the West Bank. They've got Shiite militias that are lobbing missiles and rockets and drones at them from Iraq and Syria. They've got the Houthis firing missiles and drones at them from Yemen. And then there's the Iranian regime itself. I think the question that we all have to be asking ourselves right now is whether this moment, this very dramatic moment in the Middle East, can begin to convince the Islamic Republic of Iran that this war that it's fighting is futile. In other words, we've seen Israel now completely pick apart Hamas, and today I think was the kind of the final death knell to Hamas. They've been doing a pretty good job of destroying Hezbollah in Lebanon. That fighting's still ongoing, but I would say the leadership there has been eviscerated as well. The Israelis have carried a number of decapitation strikes. The question is now, does the regime in Iran begin to doubt the wisdom of its strategy, or does it press forward? These are the sorts of questions that we're asking ourselves right now.
I definitely want to ask you about the trajectory and what's next in a moment. But first, let's talk about who exactly Yahya Sinwar was. We know he was Hamas's leader in Gaza from 2017. He was named the group's overall leader in August after Hania was killed over the summer. But what do we need to know specifically about Sinwar?
Sure. Well, Yahya Sinwar actually served time in an Israeli jail. So the Israelis know him quite well. He taught himself Hebrew while he was in jail for his Hamas activity. As I understand it, he actually conceived of the plan for the 10/7 attack while he was in jail. And he considered himself to be something of a student of Israeli culture, Israeli history, Israeli politics. He was released in a prisoner swap. There were about 1,000 Israeli prisoners, or rather Hamas prisoners, who were released in exchange for one man who was held captive by Hamas. And in this, his name was Gilad Shalit. He was taken in an operation, I want to say it was 2012, when he was kidnapped, and then he was traded back in 2014. Sinwar was one of the people that was swapped in that trade. And he was able to get out, and he went back into the Gaza Strip and reemerged as a leader of Hamas. And slowly, painstakingly, over 10 years, began to plot out what would become the 10/7 attacks. What's amazing is in Israel, they sort of still kick themselves because he was treated for cancer while he was in that Israeli jail. They gave him that treatment. It was done, it was put on the bill of the Israeli state. And there are a lot of people who say that, well, gosh, that shouldn't have happened. And imagine if they just didn't treat him. But nonetheless, he came out of that, and he's been running the war ever since. He's known, by the way, for his own brutality against a lot of Palestinians, those who've been believed to have been spying on Hamas on behalf of Israel. So he's actually engaged in he did engage in a number of extrajudicial killings, but he has really he had a brutal reputation, and obviously all of that came to a crashing halt with actually what we learned was actually a surprise to the Israelis. They did not know what they were dealing with when they fell upon him and a handful of other Hamas terrorists earlier today. It was a rank and file soldiers that happened to see a number of Hamas fighters. They called in a tank to shoot at this particular building, and when they cleared through the rubble, to their surprise, they found the man who had been the architect of the 10/7 attacks.
And it was a surprise to the world, too, when Israel did post that Yahya Sinwar was eliminated. You said you're an expert here, and when you look at their organization chart, you're not seeing many leaders you recognize. So who is next in line? Is there any indication of that leader that might emerge in Hamas?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we always try to look at the external and internal leadership structures. Inside Gaza, there's Yahya Sinwar's brother, Mohammed Sinwar, who by all accounts has been actually running the war on behalf of his brother. And it's possible that he steps up and fills that void. But this is not a well-trained commander. This is not somebody with extensive military background. He was a trusted aide to his brother, and it's now going to be interesting to see what role he plays. But I don't see him as being sort of a game changer who can revive Hamas after suffering the blows that it has suffered over the last weeks and obviously over the last several hours. Abroad, it gets more interesting. There are two individuals based in Qatar that I think have the potential to play a role. The very likely person, the most recognizable person left in that org chart is a guy by the name of Khalid Meshal. Meshal was the Politburo chief. He had been based in Jordan and then Syria, and then roughly a decade ago, he moved to Qatar. And he was actually passed over for the position of the political chief of Hamas after Ismail Haniyeh was killed by the Israelis back in early August. He came out soon after trying to really, I think, establish maybe more relevance, and he actually came out and called for suicide bombings, the resumption of that very brutal tactic. And it earned him a few headlines, but he, I think, really shrank back into oblivion. People were not following him. I think now all of a sudden he is the guy that is likely to take over, literally, by the process of elimination. All the other leaders are gone. He's one of the only few people left that we recognize. I think there's an interesting opportunity, by the way, for the U.S. to use its leverage with the Qataris. The Qataris have long said that that the U.S. has bought into the fact that there is a significant Hamas headquarters in that country. By the way, it dates back a lot longer than whatever agreement was signed with the Obama administration. The Qataris have been sponsors of Hamas for the better part of 2 decades now. But there is an opportunity to press for Meshal to be extradited, to force him to go on TV, preferably Al Jazeera, and call for the complete surrender of Hamas, to call for the release of the hostages. This would be ideal. Whether the U.S. is pressing the Qataris to do this, I don't know. The only other person in Qatar that I think is even remotely recognizable right now is the international spokesman for Hamas, a guy by the name of Hussam Badran. Both of them are figures that are at least recognizable to people that have followed the group for some time. But really, when you look out at at all of the senior ranks that are left, they're not senior at all. This is a group that has been eviscerated by war. It does not look like the group that carried out the 10/7 attacks. It is now a shadow of itself. I think that's quite good news.
So then, since it is a shadow of itself, what does this mean for the trajectory of the war? Is this the beginning of the war? Is the war essentially over? Will we see the hostages be released? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a lot of noise right now in Israel. There are those who are celebrating, and then there's the hostage families who are saying that's great, but we're not celebrating. We still want the hostages released. The reports that I've seen out of the Arab world today suggest that Hamas has not reached a more flexible negotiating position as it relates to the hostages. There are those that even fear that perhaps they'll be killed because Sinwar was killed and there's really no more fighting left to be done to protect them. That's a possible option or an outcome. that we could be looking at. And that would, of course, be terrible news for the Israelis and those families in particular. But I don't know if we have a clear sense of what the trajectory of the war looks like. I mean, Hamas looks defeated, but they may continue to fight. There will always be young men in tracksuits willing to pick up AK-47s and fight in the name of Palestinian nationalism or Islamism or a combination of the two. I think we're likely to see low-level insurgency continue in the Gaza Strip for some weeks, maybe even some months. But I do think that we finally reached a moment where we can start to think about the post-war reconstruction effort, which has been something that I think folks have been reluctant in the region to engage in, that it felt too soon. I don't think it's too soon any longer. That's the good news. Again, the bad news is that this is not a war that is limited to Gaza. We are seeing that 6 other fronts are still hot. The Israelis will continue to fight those. Those are all Iran-backed actors or Iran itself still waging this war. And so even if Gaza goes quiet, there's very likely a good bit of fighting left to be done in the Middle East.
And to your point about a post-war Gaza, Israel's foreign minister did touch on this in a statement that he released. Quote, "The elimination of Sinwar opens the possibility for the immediate release of the hostages and paves the way for a change that will lead to a new reality in Gaza, without Hamas and without Iranian control." So let's talk about that potential new reality in Gaza. Do you think that's likely? What's the likelihood of that without Hamas and without Iranian control?
Well, when you have Hamas, you have Iranian control, right? Hamas is an Iranian proxy at the end of the day. But I think it's important to note, though, that Hamas is not the only Iran-backed group in Gaza. There is Islamic Jihad, and there's also a group called the Popular Resistance Committees. Actually, you could even say that the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, another small group, they have Iran support as well. I think we're watching the end of Iran's ability to bring in weapons, fighters, cash into the Gaza Strip. The Israelis have the borders sealed up, and they are really, I think, changing the equation by taking out the top leaders. 23 out of 24 fighting brigades of Hamas have been destroyed. Israel has done its work over there. So then that raises the question of what happens next. What the Israelis want is they want international donors, probably led by the UAE, maybe Saudi Arabia, certainly the United States, the Europeans, to come in and help rebuild. The Israelis are not likely to relinquish security in the Gaza Strip. They'll probably keep the army there in order to fight those pockets of resistance, that low-level insurgency. I think that's quite likely. But then comes the really interesting part, which is, what do you do with Gaza? How do you rebuild it? Do you make it look like it used to look before, which is to say a very crowded place with limited resources, or do you try to turn this place into Singapore and really try to show the Arab world that this is what happens when you purge an area of Iranian control, when you relinquish these very violent aims of a group like Hamas that, again, blended Palestinian nationalism, a vitriolic sort of brand of Palestinian nationalism, with Islamism, a deeply violent and religiously imbued ideology. If you can rid the region of Iran and these sort of factors, right, the nationalist factor and the Islamist factor, that's when I think you can begin to think about a Gaza that looks a lot different than anything we've ever seen. You can rebuild it in a way that would be sustainable, that it would live side by side with Israel. Now, the question is, how many in the Arab world are going to buy into this? And literally, who's going to pay for it? These are the questions that I think finally we're beginning to ask. My sense, by the way, is that after the election in November here, then you're going to start to see these actors come out of the woodwork in the Arab world saying, we're willing to work with you, but we want to know who we're working with first before we start making commitments, because they're going to be asking for things in return from the United States, whether it's defense guarantees, whether it's weapon systems, whatever it is, there's going to be some negotiation. We're at the souk, we're at the market. There's going to be a little haggling right now. That's not a bad thing, because I think we need to make sure that our allies trust us as we head into hopefully a new era in the Middle East.
From everything you're saying in this conversation, it really sounds like Hamas is on its last legs. They don't have the capability to respond to this in any meaningful way. But does Iran want to respond to this at all, and will they?
Right. Well, it's interesting because the Iranians right now have been bracing for an attack from Israel. Right. They carried out that attack of 181 ballistic missiles earlier this month. The Israelis have been sitting on that expected response. I mean, it's been like watching paint dry for me. I've been waiting for this attack, knowing that it's coming. You know, every day I wake up wondering whether the big news broke. It has not broken, right? So the question right now is are the Israelis going to build off of the momentum of killing Yahya Sinwar and then begin to respond to the Iranian attacks by striking in Iran? And that might really begin to change the calculus of the regime. Right now, it's hard for me to imagine the regime, which has been in a defensive posture, bracing for an Israeli attack, for them to think about going on the offensive. My guess is there'll be a day of mourning. You'll see the Iranians decry what happened. But then after that, I think you're likely to see them say, well, we're going to strike back at a time and place of our choosing, which means we're not ready to do that right now because we're bracing for a strike from Israel.
I know that you're saying this is good news for Israel, but they are still fighting a multi-front war right now. They are still involved in multiple conflicts. So what is the biggest question that you think is in the air right now and that you want to see answered?
Well, I think the next big front is Lebanon, right? The Israelis took out a lot of Hezbollah fighters in that very ingenious exploding pager operation. And then the exploding walkie-talkies the day after that. They were able to kill Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of the group. They've been able to kill Hashim Safieddine, the heir apparent to Nasrallah, and a bunch of other leaders. They've already gone into southern Lebanon, and they've been destroying a lot of weaponry. They've been going house to house. They've killed, I think, 300 or 400 Hezbollah fighters so far. They've captured a few, and they're debriefing them back in Israel. They've been making a lot of progress there, and I think it's been good progress from Israel's perspective. The question now, in my mind, the big question is, are they going to double down? Are they going to go deeper into Lebanon? Are they going to push for, the sort of same fate to Hezbollah as they just secured with Hamas? Or are they going to try to go the route of diplomatic negotiations, try to force Hezbollah through the offices of the U.S. or the UN or the French or whomever to get Hezbollah to move north of the Litani River? This is that river that runs east-west across the sort of belt of Lebanon. International law dating back to 2006 requires Hezbollah to be above that river. It's about 10 miles north of the Israeli border. That's what the Israelis would probably like to see happen so they don't have to fight. In the same breath, though, you have to understand the Israelis are now in what they call their post-10/7 reality, that they look at their borders now as potentially just catastrophic killing zones. And so they may not be okay with just a diplomatic agreement with Hezbollah. They may decide that they need to do to Hezbollah exactly what they did to Hamas. So there's a lot of question marks there. That's the big front right now. The other fronts that we talked about, West Bank, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, they're lesser fronts from Israel's perspective. But even above all of that, there's the big thing that looms over all of it, which is the Iranian regime itself. Will it try to make a dash to a nuclear weapon? Will it try to use that as the ultimate insurance policy that it's able to continue to fight Israel by proxy with this weapon in its pocket, threatening, if you come after us, this is what we're going to use against you. This is the fear that we have, and that's the great unknown.
Well, there are certainly a lot of unknowns, but as the conflicts and the situations in the Middle East continue to develop, I hope you come back on and join me, break them down, and provide your insight. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for joining me.
Anytime, my pleasure.